The Lord be with you. I want to begin a new series today, talking about a couple of different things and how they converge. The first of which is just the Bible itself. Um, the Bible is a very mysterious and interesting book, and that is kind of a discussion in and of itself, how it's written at different points in history by different authors with different circumstances. And by the time we get it, it just kind of has this overall mystique to it. And we take for granted that there's great diversity in it. But the other thing is, how to read the Bible. There are lots of people who adhere to this style, this method called the lectionary. The lectionary was developed centuries ago by the church as a way to sort of move through the Bible in a 3-year cycle. So they camp on each of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for each of the 3 years. John just kind of gets sprinkled in here and there. And it doesn't hit every single verse in the Bible, but it does move you through the majority of the scriptures. And that's kind of the point. It sort of follows that Jewish method in the synagogues of moving through the Hebrew scriptures systematically throughout the year, throughout the seasons, just to make sure that you read the majority of it. In more recent years, I read a report from some churches who utilize the lectionary that they discovered, after polling their people who grew up with the lectionary over years, that whereas people could remember kind of individualistic stories in the Bible, like the 23rd Psalm or the birth of Jesus, or God creating things, or some of the stories of the prophets, they had no real idea how any of those stories fit together. They were just sort of disproportionate, disjunctive. They just sort of existed as an amalgamation of sort of free-form, unconnected stories. And obviously that's concerning to people because the Bible, although it's diverse and although it has a lot of different genres and a lot of different styles and purposes for each individual writing, it does tell kind of a coherent whole story. Sometimes they call this the controlling narrative or the meta-narrative, the big story. And a lot of us don't always understand that. So the question is, if you could tell the grand story of the Bible, which individual stories would you pick and choose to sort of condense it and to draw it out for people? So that's the first thought I have. The second thought has to do with sort of how the church has told the holy stories over the centuries. So in those early years after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, we know that it was primarily oral storytelling. People would tell stories about Jesus, but it was all pretty much word of mouth. And then they would use the Hebrew scriptures to look back and to try and see how they pointed to Jesus. That way seemed to go on for decades. And then as you read the New Testament now, you see that eventually some of the apostles established churches, and those churches spread, and as they spread, they would write letters. Well, those letters are what become the majority of the New Testament for us. And somewhere in there also, people sat down and wrote sort of the life story of Jesus. And again, we have 4 different versions of that. So somewhere in the decades after the oral traditions came the written scriptures. And then kind of centuries after that, as we were in these dark ages of history, and again, society was pre-literate. This is before the printing press. We find that churches primarily communicated to the non-literate masses through images and icons, and sometimes through stained glass. Stained glass is still a tradition that exists as part of visual storytelling of the stories in the Bible. Now, when you put those two things together, the overall grand story of the Bible, as well as this history of stained glass and images, I'm very intrigued by our church, Zion Evangelical Covenant Church, and how we have come to use stained glass in our sanctuary. So long before I was here, there are these windows that surround the entire sanctuary, and they tell a grand story, an overarching story of the holy things that are going on, the important things that are going on for us to know as a congregation. So what I want to do in these videos is just take these very short glimpses at the visual storytelling style in our stained glass windows and talk about how they inform us about what people thought, at least the people who designed these windows and chose these windows. What are the important things to know from Scripture? So I'm going to begin with the very first stained glass window we have in that series of stained glass windows. This one is in the northwest corner of the sanctuary, and it is about creation, or the birth of the universe. So the one verse, each stained glass window has one verse attached to it, or at least a fragment of a verse. And this one is from Genesis 1:1. God created the heavens and the earth. So what you'll see in the picture is there are stars and kind of a dark color for space or night. There are planets. There are the sun and the moon. There's the earth, which is kind of a neutral color, kind of void. And over the top of the earth, you'll see kind of wind and water, which is very reminiscent of what we see there in Genesis 1. It is good to know that we have an origin story in Holy Scripture. If you want to know where the world around you came from, it's not an accident. You are not an accident. There is an all-powerful, sovereign God. The first chapter of Genesis calls him Elohim, just a generic name for God. It's actually in the plural, which can either mean more than one God or can mean an intensification. So the God of gods. He created all things. He spoke them into existence. So this is a king who has power and authority, and his decrees that are spoken are sure to come to pass. His word accomplishes its purpose. His word brings order out of the chaos. His word brings about all of the environments, the skies or the heavens above, and everything that fills them, the waters, the seas beneath, and everything that fills them, and the dry land. And he's created these firm and fixed boundaries for all things to exist in. So while you've got creatures that roam about on the land, and creatures that swim in the seas, and creatures that fly in the skies, and even these heavenly lights and luminaries up in the heavens, the question is, who is God going to use to take care of all of these environments and all of these creatures that fill the environments? And our stained glass windows purposely stop there. You have to wait for the next stained glass window to find out what the pinnacle of God's creation is. And that, therefore, will give us a better sense of our identity and our purpose. So this is just a foretaste and just the beginning to know that there is purpose and meaning in the world, and you are part of it, and it's all connected back to the sovereign divine creator. So, in these days of ongoing pandemic, may the peace of God be with you. Amen.